seeing them in the natural environment, like I want to be able to see that in my reptile room. I want to be able to see them, doing the things they might do out in nature. And so I've tried to, adapt my caging and things like that to be more naturalistic or larger, or, give them aspects of their natural history that they can benefit from. So that's kind of the main things I changed. But
and it's kind of nice to have an actual mental image of seeing one of the animals in the wild, because then if you do set up an enclosure, you can kind of use that as a base and go, this is exactly what I saw, and that's where they live in the wild. So that's pretty cool. Welcome back to the Animals at Home podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in today. On this episode, I am speaking with Dr. Justin Julander, who is a virologist out of Utah State University. He's also the owner and operator of the reptile breeding business, Australian Addiction Reptiles. Justin is also the author of some incredibly common books in the hobby, including The Complete Children's Python, as well as The Complete Carpet Python, which him and Nick Mutton, the co-author on that book, are working on a second edition, which should be out shortly. We discussed that in this episode and some of the changes they've made, because that is one of those books that has gone widely successful. And if you look for the first edition on Amazon right now, they're like hundreds of dollars because there are none for sale. They sold out in the last few years. So I cannot wait for the second edition. So we talk about some changes that have been made there. Of course, we discuss viruses and snake viruses and serpentovirus. We discuss Justin's herping trips to Australia. He's made quite a few treks over Australia, so we talk about some of the information he's learned from those natural habitats and how he's incorporated that into his herpetoculture at home. And finally, we discuss his podcast. I forgot to mention at the top of this, but he's also the host of the Reptile Fight Club Podcast, which is a great, unique idea for a show. They have an idea, and they bring on two people who have an opposing opinion on that idea. So whether that be UV lighting or power feeding or how we taxonomically distinguish different species, and they have a fight about it, quote unquote. And basically it's a friendly debate, and I find it very valuable. So we discuss that, and of course we get into a few details about some of the topics that they cover as well. And before we jump into the episode, make sure you head to animalsathomenetwork.com if you're looking for more information on this show. If you would like to support the show financially or help support the show financially, you can do that for as little as $3 a month over at patreon.com/animalsathome. At the $3 a month tier, you automatically have access to the Discord server, which is a place where you can chat with the other listeners. And I, of course, pop in there now and again as well. And there's just some fantastic conversations going in there. Lots of photos being shared of enclosures and setups, and it's great. So I hope to have you there. And of course, the financial support is huge. I do really appreciate it. I'm super grateful for everybody that does support that way, because it does help the show grow. And I want to continue to grow the show, both have listenership, but as well as quality, and continue to make the show better. So that does really help. But if you aren't supporting financially, the best thing you can do is share this on YouTube, or not YouTube, share it on Facebook or social media, share it with your friends and your family. That really does help the algorithm. It helps us grow the show, and I'm really grateful for that as well. Thank you so much to CustomReptileHabitats.com for sponsoring this episode of the podcast. You can find an affiliate link below. It is animalsathome.ca/CRH. If you type that into your URL, or you go to the show notes and click that link, that will bring you to the CustomReptileHabitats.com website. And if you do make a purchase, a small commission comes back to me at no extra cost to you. And of course, that is another way you can help support the show and also buy yourself a new enclosure or a new item for one of your animals. All right, let's jump into the episode. Enjoy. Well, Justin, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, happy to be here. I really enjoy your podcast. You guys put out really great information and have a lot of interesting and informative guests. So yeah.
Good. I appreciate that. And it's always nice to talk to another podcaster, someone that's comfortable chatting behind the mic. So we'll get into your podcast as well, because I've been really enjoying it. I've been binging it lately, getting ready for this one, and I've been really enjoying it. But let's just start with sort of a bit about your history. When I look at your Instagram page, I get the sense that reptiles are part of your passion, but it seems like you're also just passionate about nature, because you have lots of other animals, birds and whatnot. So has that been the case for a long time, or is that true even?
Definitely. Yeah. So I was very fortunate to have a father that took me out into the the wilderness quite often. So I was kind of a desert rat. I like to go out in the deserts, and Utah is a great place for good deserts. We have, a few national parks that in the desert areas down in the southern part of the state. And so we spent a lot of time down there. He gave me the option to either go hunting or to go backpacking. And so I chose backpacking, and it's been a really good thing. And it was funny because all the big animals, you'd see these giant deer on the national parks where they were trying to hide out from the hunters. But so, yeah, I've always been fascinated by animals in general, nature in general. I mean, I love, rocks and trees and just about anything out in the wild.
And at what point did reptiles enter the picture for you?
I think I can kind of trace it back, probably like most people, back to, the second grade dinosaur books, and reptiles were always in the back. And so that's kind of, my introduction to the living dinosaurs, even though that's probably not so true.
And did you start keeping as a kid as well?
Yeah. Again, my parents were very nice to let me keep just about anything I'd bring home. So I remember my friend, his uncle caught a rattlesnake, a little newborn rattlesnake. And it was, he's like, "Oh, you like snakes? Here, have this. And can I keep it?" And my parents like, "Yeah, I guess." So I kept a few rattlesnakes as a kid.
Were those your first?
No, that wasn't my first.
Okay.
Well, my first snake was a rubber boa that my cousin gave me. So,
okay.
and it didn't fare too well, I have to admit, and I was pretty young, and it was probably not the best pet to start with. I had a gopher snake, Great Basin gopher snake, shortly after that, and that one did a lot better. We had that for quite a while. They're pretty tough snakes, and I really enjoyed keeping that. And then, lizards and other tarantulas and things like that, just whatever I could find out in the desert.
Well, your parents must have been pretty understanding if they let you keep a rattlesnake.
Definitely. Well, and I was out of the country for a couple of years, and so my parents watched over the few animals that I had at that time, and one of them was a midget faded rattlesnake, and it was my mom went in to check on it, and she was looking in the cage, couldn't see it, but she heard it rattling, and she looked up and it was on top of the cage, like just face to face. So she ran out of the room. And so, I got rid of him after I got back, just because of that experience. I couldn't bear to have my mom get bit or something.
No.
That would be, I couldn't live with that. So
yeah,
got rid of those after that. But, I guess you live and learn. But
yeah, exactly.
Fortunately, nobody was ever bit, or we didn't have any incidences. So.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, I was just listening to, I forget what episode of your podcast, and you were saying that you were looking for sidewinders, and that was one of your favorite species. And then you said you pulled up to somebody on the side of the road who's also herping, and they're free handling away these sidewinders. It's amazing that people do that.
It's nuts. I just pulled away. I'm like, I'm not going to put up with that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. I mean, I live in an area where there's no venomous snakes, and so I can't. It's hard for me to imagine just the average Joe just running into the wilderness and picking up venomous snakes. But I guess when they're so common and people think that it's totally fine to handle them, maybe it's generations of people saying it's not a big deal. It probably happens more often than it should.
Yeah, I mean, there's even religions down here that specialize in venomous snake handling, or that's one of their tenets or whatever. But they still get bit once in a while, and people die, and it just takes once, and that's it can put you out for a bit, if not permanently. So you need to be careful, and I always had kind of that misconception that, something like a cottonmouth or a copperhead weren't that dangerous, but I was corrected that, there are some mortalities that occur due to cottonmouth bites or copperhead bites. So, if you just have to be allergic or have the wrong reaction to the venom, and it can go south. But I think for the most part, venomous snakes are very, maligned, undeservedly. They're pretty quiet, and I mean, they're the most polite snake out there. They give you a warning and tell you where they are, and
don't touch.
Yep, exactly.
So then you have this obsession with nature, and of course reptiles are getting folded in. And did you at one point want to pursue a career focused on animals or nature in some way? Because you kind of have, but not in the way that you may have thought when you were younger.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, anytime anybody asked me what I was going to be, it was herpetologist, from very early age on. My dad bought me a herpetology textbook when I was in fourth or fifth grade. I think it was between fourth and fifth grade. And that's what I read that summer for the reading program. So all these kids came back with, hundreds of books that they read over the summer. And I came back, I read one book, and it was a college textbook. And my dad said I had all my, pets, all their taxonomy listed out and things.
That's awesome.
Where they fit in the reptile families and stuff. So, I've been very interested in the science side of it as well, and doing studies, and so that's what I'd always planned to be. And then I met my wife, and she said, "Well, what kind of jobs are out there?" Oh, I don't know. I looked into it, and
reality.
Yeah, exactly. And well, now if we're going to get married and you are going to be out in the field for, a couple months out of the year, I don't know about that. Oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that either. And so, I knew I wanted to do something in science, and so I began looking at other careers in science. And I had an uncle that actually was a virologist, and so he said, "Oh, you got to come and check out what we do." And so went and saw, and I thought, "Oh, that sounds really interesting." So I went into virology, and I think it was overall a good decision, because I kind of kept reptiles and amphibians as my passion, and something that was kind of an escape, that I didn't want to necessarily make it a job and have to, I got to go think about reptiles again today, hit the old grindstone. So it's been kind of nice that way.
Yeah, that can be a trap that I think people fall into, is they want to start a breeding business or some sort of reptile related business, and they confuse themselves into thinking that they can turn their passion to their work, and then it becomes work and it's no longer enjoyable. So it is kind of nice to separate it completely.
Yeah. And sometimes I kind of second guess, maybe I should have done that, because I don't know, it just doesn't leave me, that's what drives me a lot of times. So, but it is what it is, and I'm happy with the path that I chose.
Has your work, your PhD, or just your work in virology, has it translated at all into herpetoculture at all? Obviously, we have a few fairly major viruses that are circulating the community, and do those worlds link up for you?
Yeah. So I had a kind of a near miss a while back. There was a group that the group that discovered IBD was caused by, an arena-like virus. And we were in discussions to see if they could fund some animal work in our facility. Cause we have a fairly nice animal facility, and a lot of the stuff I do is modeling viral diseases in rodents for the most part. And so, we wanted to kind of prove Koch's postulate and show that infection with this virus would actually result in those disease manifestations that people report for IBD. And so, you can say, "Hey, I discovered this," but you got to show that it does what it should do, kind of thing. So I was looking into it and talking with the facility manager to see if we could get some facility space and what kind of caging and things, and it just seemed like it was going to be too expensive for the amount that they were willing to kind of fund for the work, and so it ended up not going through. But more recently, they had and unfortunately it's been a couple of years, but they had a fundraiser at one of the carpet fests, and they raised money for nidovirus research, which they've changed the name of the snake nidoviruses to serpentoviruses. So now, the proper term is serpentovirus. So,
interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So they raised like $10,000 or more, maybe $15,000 for the research. And so they funded 3 different institutions, about $5,000 each. So my portion was to look at antivirals, because that's my specialty is antiviral research, and so we have quite a few antivirals that our group has purchased and things like that we can test that have shown broad activity against many different viruses. And, maybe they're some are clinically used and others are, more research used. But so we that's kind of what we did with our funding is tested, but we had to wait until there was a model system. So that's the challenge, right? Once you identify that there's a virus there, you have to find a way to grow it. And it was pretty picky. These viruses are fairly particular in what cells they grow up in. And so the researchers, Stephen Tillis, he was part of the research to identify a cell line that would support the growth of the virus, where we can see what's called the cytopathic effect, or when the virus chews holes in a cell monolayer. And so he identified a couple different cell lines. One is a diamond python heart cell, and he's got a couple others as well, but that's the one that they sent us. And so we've been growing up viruses in these diamond python heart cells and trying to inhibit their growth with different antiviral compounds.
Well, that's one thing that I always found interesting about, I guess, serpentovirus is, well, I guess we do have a few human viruses that do stay internally forever, HIV, for example, but for most part, when I think of a virus, I think of something, just like COVID, for example, or the common cold. You shed it, and once your immune system activates and it's gone, it's not circulating your system anymore, or at least I think that's how it is. But it seemed always sort of bizarre to me that serpentovirus continues to stay in those sick animals, as if is it? Maybe I'm oversimplifying things, but is it similar to an HIV where it just stays in that system?
I'm not sure on the exact mechanism. I don't know that we know for sure what the mechanism of persistence is with serpentovirus, but I mean, there's lots of different ways that viruses can kind of hide out. I mean, herpes virus hides out in your nerves, and when you're stressed and things, you can have a reactivation and you'll get a cold sore or something. Other virus like Ebola virus was shown to hide out in the testes, and so you could have an Ebola. It's not necessarily actively replicating, but it's kind of hiding out or persisting in that tissue. And, that's a kind of a tender spot for a virus to hang out in. And so also in the eyeballs, the Ebola was found to persist within the eyes. And these are what's known as immunoprivileged sites. So they're not completely, outside of the realm of the immune system, but you don't want to go destroying cells in your eyes or in your testes. And so they're sites where the immune response is kind of moderated or controlled to some extent. So you don't have that pathology that's associated. So a lot of viruses don't actually cause the destruction of tissue. It's actually your immune system trying to get rid of the virus that's killing cells and causing damage to tissues. And then all these tissue damage brings in different immune cells, and they release cytokines and chemokines and things. And so you have this big storm of immune mediators that can cause tissue damage and things. And so, so that's pathology is a big part of viral infection in a lot of cases.
It's pretty fascinating. Do you think it's promising, those antivirals? Is that something that eventually do you think will be something that will be consistently available, maybe, who knows, 5-10 years, that we can start combating this issue? Or is it still too early? I
mean, that's the hope. It's a little tricky. So, I work with a lot of what are termed neglected tropical diseases like yellow fever or dengue, and there's no approved antivirals to treat these viruses, even though they cause, in the case of dengue, cause, hundreds of millions of cases a year. There's nothing to treat those. They did develop a vaccine, but it's very tricky because there's 4 different kind of closely related viruses, but they're different enough that they're antigenically different. And so the immune system, the immune response to one is not the same as the immune response to another. And so you actually have an increase in pathology if you're exposed to one dengue and you get another, serotype and get infected with a second serotype, you can have an enhanced disease.
Yeah, actually, I had dengue when I went to Costa Rica.
Did you?
And luckily I didn't get sick till I came home. Thank God for that, because it was horrible. But that's one of my friends who's a doctor, and he was saying, now you're at risk for a more severe disease if you get it again, if it's a slightly different, I guess, variant, and which is kind of scary to think.
Yeah. So, there's lots of different antivirals that we've identified that have activity against these viruses. And actually, one that we've published on was actually used to treat a patient, and they seem to recover, but it's an N of 1, and it's not a true study. So obviously, clinical studies need to occur for those drugs to be approved for clinical use, and that's tricky with things like yellow fever that have maybe a seasonal or unpredictable emergence pattern where you don't know for sure if you're going to have enough people that are infected to be able to test the antiviral and the placebo. So it's tricky. Yeah.
So, and then, then if you move to veterinary medicine, it becomes even trickier because less funding and way more variables, it seems like. And so how worried are you about serpentivirus in the community? Is that something that you think about on a regular basis, or is it something that you think we can relatively manage as long as people are, keeping things clean and whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a mixed bag. I think there's a little bit of overreaction to it, and I mean, we saw this with COVID too. There's some people that like, oh, it's not even real. And from the it's not real end of the spectrum all the way to, I'm going to put myself in a bubble and not see anybody for the next 2 years, so there can be, there's definitely some middle ground there. And I think we don't know a lot, and that's part of the problem is we need to know more before we can either panic or not panic, I guess.
Yeah.
There's we're not sure. So I guess a scenario that I kind of think about a lot is are the serpentoviruses that we're seeing that cause severe disease, is that because they're being introduced to other species? You know what I mean? So maybe a one that was originally in a ball python had kind of co-evolved with the ball python, and so it's not severe in the ball python. But if you get your ball python close to your green tree python, all of a sudden that virus jumps into the green tree and causes very severe disease. And so we don't know kind of which ones are pathogenic and which ones are tolerated, or which species they're more pathogenic in. So it becomes very difficult even to identify maybe where their origin is. But we know in the wild that, say, there's the shingleback skink virus that's causing a lot of morbidity and mortality. And, several viruses obviously have emerged to cause severe disease. There's the what's the turtle, the Murray River turtle that had a lot of mass die-offs in their range, and they were worried about the survival of that species. So this is, nothing new. This happens all the time, and we're watching it happen, or the tail end of it happening in humans. And that came from, most likely an animal species. And so, viruses jump, and usually they don't cause severe disease in their natural host. And so another one like that comes to mind is West Nile virus. West Nile virus replicates very efficiently in little sparrows and, kind of these smaller birds, and it doesn't cause much disease in them. They can replicate the virus to very high titers that can then be spread by mosquitoes to dead end hosts like humans, where we can get an illness, but we're not going to replicate the virus to high enough levels for a mosquito to take a blood meal from us and transmit it to somebody else. So we're what's called a dead end host, horses, humans, but we also have more severe disease than the natural hosts, like the little birds. So, and that's not consistent between birds either, because if crows get it, they die pretty quickly. So, it's a very complicated thing out there and it requires quite a bit of research. And of course, veterinary research is somewhat limited.
Yeah. Well, that's amazing. It's amazing how many moving targets there are, and every virus is so different than the other. So it's like you're opening up a fresh book every time you need to study something. So no, that's pretty interesting. Why don't we talk a little bit about your reptile business, because you do have a passion that we talked about earlier, and you have you've kept it out of your workplace, but you do probably work on it because you do have a business. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how that started?
Yeah. So I guess shortly after I got married, I thought, well, I'm going to try to keep them in captivity, at least try to keep them as pets and stuff. And I noticed a little bearded dragon female scratching around at the pet store, and I thought, oh, and she looked very full, and so I said, I'll take that one, and I bought her and took her home, and she laid a clutch of eggs, and I hatched them out, and I thought, oh, that was fun, that's pretty easy, and I sold the babies back to the pet store once I got them up and going, and I thought, oh, well, I can kind of pay for the collection this way, and so that kind of started the breeding side of it. Now, I think, like most of us, there's a bit of a pendulum swing, right? You swing one way. And so I got really excited about, oh, I'm going to make all this money and I'm going to breed all these animals and things like that. And it had its challenges, and I've probably, I've learned a lot of hard lessons that way. And, for example, the bearded project, I bought more and more, but I didn't quarantine them properly and ended up getting, mites and internal parasites and things. And then they kind of stopped breeding and slowly faded away. And so that was not, the best, it was a hard learning experience, and it was, and over time I'm realizing, I just need to enjoy these things and not be so worried about money and selling animals and making money. So I'm a terrible salesman to begin with. So I've got way too many animals because I don't put out ads and things like that. So, but so I'm the pendulum has swung to the other side now, where I'm maybe should sell more, but I don't sell too many these days, just because I'm too lazy to get out ads or whatnot. But
and once you have all those offspring, sometimes it's hard to sell them into the market, because who knows who's going to get them, and you want to make sure they go to right homes and everything. And
that's
so
always on my mind as well. Yeah.
You moved from bearded dragons to how did that progress as they fizzled out?
Yeah, well, it was more of the project kind of fizzling out, and realizing, bearded dragons take up quite a bit of room, and the babies need quite a bit of attention. And this was right as I was finishing my undergraduate degree and getting ready to move up to grad school. And so I found out that, the grad school life is very time consuming, and I didn't have a lot of time for the reptiles. And so I kind of transitioned more away from lizards and more into snakes that, didn't require such daily attention to, comparatively, I guess. And so I started getting into the Australian pythons, and those were some of my first interests anyway. I really enjoyed just about any reptile. So, but the Australian pythons really have a special place for me. So
was there something specific about the Australian animals, the Australian pythons, that you were drawn to?
I think it's that, just the exoticness, that how far, they're far away, and just they had such weird, animals like a frilled dragon, that can put out such a large flap of their neck skin or whatever, and as a warning, or blue tongue skink with a bright blue tongue, those kind of things really caught my attention. And I think as far as the pythons go, I was looking through a book, and I saw that, or I can't remember if it was online or in a book, but it was this picture of a Centralian carpet, a Morelia bredli, on a cliff, this red rock cliff out in the deserts of central Australia. And growing up, going to the deserts of southern Utah that looked very similar, I thought, oh, if I could find a python that lived, in the desert, how cool would that be? So that's kind of what got my interest in the Morelia genus and the carpet pythons specifically. And so that's when I kind of started looking into those more and getting involved in the groups. And but my wife was a little timid about snakes, especially pythons. Of course, most non-reptile people think of pythons as very big and scary.
Yeah.
So I had to start her out a little easily. And so we got some milk snakes, and some, the little tiny baby milk snakes are very cute for my wife. And so she allowed that. And then after a while, she's like, okay, they're not so scary. And she let me get some jungle carpet pythons. So that was my first foray into build up that progression. Australian pythons. Yep. Had to kind of work her into that, I guess, or ease her into it.
Yeah. I think we're all familiar with that a little bit, at least. And then right now, do you have a few breeding projects on the go, or are you just mostly keeping, or?
No, I did get pretty heavy into the carpet pythons, and that was kind of the impetus to write the book. I really, there wasn't a ton of great information out there, and it wasn't in one place. So thought, let's put this down on paper and write a book. And then that kind of started me down that path of whenever I was interested in a group, it kind of involved writing about them as well, because I would get into the literature, try to find as much information as I could about their natural history and about, that kind of aspect of their keeping. And so, why not just write it down while you're researching it yourself? And there's a lot of good information in the scientific publications, but it's kind of harder to find. And so that was kind of the idea, is to use my skills that I developed during my PhD of reading papers and interpreting papers, and then being able to kind of bring that to the layman or whatever you want to say there. But yeah.
And so was the carpet python book the first book you wrote?
Yeah, that was the first book, and we finished that one. Nick Mutton and I finished that in 2010, and so, or 2011, somewhere around there. And then the book, the complete children's Python, followed pretty shortly after that.
And that was with Nick as well, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And we also brought in Peter Birch on that one. He's kind of the Antaresia king of Australia. But so after the carpets kind of rose in popularity, and like I said, I'm not a great salesman, and so there were a lot of people breeding carpets or bringing them in from Europe and things like that, and so I kind of put those on the back burner. I produce a few here and there, but I kind of changed my focus over the Antaresia, the smaller pythons, so a little bit more manageable in size, and so not many people working with those, so I've been pretty successful with a lot of those.
Well, and they're a perfect species for the hobby, for keeping, right?
Yeah.
There's just small group of animals. And I've said it so many times in the podcast that I do wish we start gravitating towards the smaller species, just because it's so much easier to provide for them, because they don't take up a lot of space. And it'd be nice to see Antaresia just more popular. And I don't know if in Canada, I rarely see them. It's really uncommon.
Yeah. It's interesting. I spend most of my time at reptile shows educating people to the fact that there are, the snakes in the genus Antaresia, or that there are these little pythons. Sometimes people will have heard of children's pythons, and so that opens the door a little bit easier. But a lot of people don't know there's a bunch of really cool small snakes.
Yeah. And then you also wrote 2 other books as well, right? When I was on your site, I think there's a green tree python book and knobtail geckos. So were you just, like you said, you were just realizing that there was a space of information or a void there, so you would just get down to business and make a book for us?
Yeah, to some extent. So I hadn't really kept green tree pythons, and I visited my friend Terry Phillip out at Reptile Gardens, and man, he's a very knowledgeable, just great guy. And so I was able to kind of forge a friendship there by visiting him out at the Reptile Gardens, and he had several green tree pythons, and he kind of cleared up a lot of myths and misconceptions about how to keep green tree pythons. And I thought, that doesn't sound too bad. They don't sound like some expert level snake. And so I thought, well, I'm going to look into these guys. So I got reading the literature, and man, there was a lot of good information hidden away in those papers. And I think, some of the keepers knew these things and were kind of changing their methods. But for the most part, people were keeping them way too hot, feeding them way too often. You think of the rainforest as this hot, muggy, place, but I mean, I visited their habitat, and we found actually a couple individuals up in the Cape York Peninsula in Iron Range National Park up there, and found a couple individuals. And I mean, it was 70s within the forest. If you stepped outside the forest, it was fairly warm, in the sun. But for the most part, it's pretty stable around 70, 75, 80 degrees. It doesn't get much hotter than that. And so I thought, well, wait a second, everybody's keeping them at 92 and, just on a stick over, and they're having all these problems. And so, and then looking at their natural history, they don't seem to eat all that often. Like it's kind of a rare event for them to capture food. And so I actually included a little bit in the book on some of their prey species and their the reproductive biology of their prey species. When the offspring were weaned, and when they might be able to find an easy meal in a freshly weaned animal, and how big they are at weaning, things like that. There were some really cool studies done on some of the prey species that the green trees go for. So a lot of information from the Australian population. So
right.
Not a lot has what was done at the time with the New Guinea population, but since then they've had a few publications, rearranging the species and things like that. So I think we're gonna maybe put out another book on green trees, just because there's a little bit more known now. But I thought that was kind of the main drive to write that book, was just the disconnect between the natural history and how people are keeping them in captivity was pretty stark.
Well, we are, as a hobby, bad for just following what the last guy did as far as care, and it just goes back all the way back to the guy who brought in the wild caught imports, and was able to keep them alive, and we're just, sometimes we get stuck in this groove of keeping, and there's no way to get out of it. So we do need those literature and information to say, hey, this is actually completely wrong. And yeah, the animals are living, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're living to their highest capacity. Yeah.
I like the analogy of, if everybody that had a baby put it right in intensive care, is that necessary?
Yes.
Probably not, for most babies. For some babies it is, and for these early imports that were on a boat for, several months or whatever, coming over and just were in terrible conditions, and they just needed that, intense care and more, sensitive things, trying these methods to try to hydrate them and things. But a captive bred and born hatchling doesn't need necessarily those same care methods. So,
and then as far as writing a book, it's almost, I'm not going to say writing books are outdated. I love having books. I love having reptile books. It's my favorite thing to buy. But at the same time, we're in this information age where everything's on the internet. Yeah. And so in some ways, writing a book is almost not a strange move, but it's I love it that we do have these books, but it's in some ways a risk almost. It's a lot of work. And like you said, you have to update them. It's not as easily to update. So what do you see as the value of having a physical book?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think we our editor or publisher kind of had that same, fear that we really want this to do well. And, we don't want to print 5,000 books and be sitting on a mountain of books for the next 20 years or something. So, we had to kind of talk them into, this is going to be a good idea or whatever. But, obviously once you put pen to paper, it becomes outdated as soon as it's published. So that's kind of the I guess good and bad, because obviously, there's a need for things to be written down. And I think in this information age, you also have, the Snapchat thing where it just disappears. And so you might have really good information on the internet, but to find that and to verify that it's, reasonable information is somewhat difficult. And so even though we have pretty much everything at the touch of a button, there's still a lot of things that, that maybe work their way in that are not quite right. And I think, to me as a virologist, that was no more evident than during this last pandemic, and seeing just the misinformation that was passed along as good information in social media and online. And so even though you have access to real good information, people have a hard time differentiating. And so that's why I think published literature, scientific publications and books are still important and still needed in this information age.
Yeah, I completely agree. A lot of times I say it's not as much of an information age as it is an age of entertainment. And that's really what the internet is. And for some reason, when I read a reptile book or any book, it immediately has more authority to me when I read it. I think, okay, this is someone has sat down, took the risk of putting a book together, right? It's not just, you're not just sending off a tweet on a whim or making a YouTube video in 5 seconds. You actually have to sit down and do the research, and there's sources in the back and whatnot. And I love having books, and I think it's important. And then you guys are actually redoing some of these books. I think I'm sure you're almost done the second edition of the Carpet Python book, and it's a nice update. There's nothing wrong with having to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And we learn more, it's not like, once we hit a certain point, we know it all and we can move on, and more things are researched, more studies are done, more field work is done, and we learn new things. And so why not include those and get those out there as well? So the second edition of the complete carpet python is very, very near completion. We're just going through the last final check of, making sure all our T's are crossed and I's are dotted. And so that can be very tedious and time consuming. And I had hoped to have it done, months ago, but, we're still going through it and making sure that everything's good. Because that's another part of this is, once you print it, it's there. I was reading a book yesterday and I noticed 2 or 3 mistakes on just within a couple pages of each other, and I'm thinking, oh no, they didn't do their due diligence here. They didn't look too closely. I could have found those for them in a few minutes. But so it is tricky, and once I think, when you write something and you stare at it for months at a time, and, you miss a lot of those things because you're the one that put it down. And so it kind of escaped you the first time. And so a lot of times, I'll put down a chapter and then come back to it a couple months later and look over it again. So these last final checks have been really good. I mean, I'm coming up with pages of mistakes and corrections, in something that I thought was pretty well polished. But, yeah, it's good to go through it, but it is time consuming. But we're pretty much 99% of the way done. And I think Tuesday we're going to send it out to get the blue line back, the physical copy that we can kind of look through and make sure that it looks right and all the pages are in order and there's nothing missing, that kind of thing. So. Well, I'm very excited.
Yeah, and everybody's excited because it's the same thing that happened with Vin's book too, with the complete boa. It's just the first one sold out. You see them on Amazon for like hundreds of dollars. I was looking on Amazon the other day; it was like $200 for a copy. So the demand is going to be there, and everybody wants to see the updated information. And so when you are rewriting the book, did you guys start with the old book and copy and paste in other ways, and then go back in and change it, or did you have to go fresh?
I mean, we built on what we'd written previously, and it's kind of nice. Like I said, when you write it and you're in the thick of it, you come back 10 years later and you might think, oh, I don't know if I agree with that so much anymore. And you can go back and kind of rewrite things. I think one nice example of that is we talked about, there's a lot of misconceptions of size in reptiles. And I think often average size is conflated with maximum size. Yes. And so we have this idea that, coastal carpets get 10 feet long. And, whereas the majority of coastal carpets that are, there was a study done in Brisbane area, and this was like a snake rescue thing. And they recorded all these, I think there were like 2,000 or maybe it was like 300 or something. Coastal carpets that they rescued from people's homes, and they got average weights and lengths and things. And it's like they average 6 foot and, a couple thousand grams or something. So, you kind of have an idea of, okay, this is the average. This is what you should be shooting for. And we missed that in the first round. That publication was out before the first edition was released. And so we could have included that information, but we were so focused on, okay, coastal carpet, here's how big a coastal carpet can get. And here's records of how big they get and things like that. But and then, seeing how people take that and say, oh, your coastal carpet's only 6 feet, it really should be more like 10 feet. And so then I need to feed it more. And, then you run into obesity issues and things like that. So it was a nice chance to kind of reevaluate what we wrote in the first edition, and then include all the newly published information that's out there that's been released within the last 10 years. And so right. Another thing I was really excited about, and I was kind of waiting until the book was published to kind of talk a little bit about this, but then Nick was on one of the podcasts and he started talking about it. So I guess we're talking about it. But it was the idea of how carpet pythons kind of came to be in taxonomy, and how they differ or there's a lot of ideas that, carpet pythons are just kind of one continuous group of snakes that occur along the East Coast. But a lot of the taxonomic work that's been done, at least the most thorough taxonomic work that's been done, as well as, kind of shows some breaks in that. And I was thinking about that and thinking, why are the breaks where they're at? and I started thinking about, well, what causes a break in gene flow, and what prevents them from intermingling. And so I got to thinking, well, how do carpets usually move around, and they usually are associated with trees, and so tree lined water courses and things like that. So I thought, well, I wonder if the water basins in Australia kind of correspond with that those genetic breaks. And so I got to looking, and it was almost like too good to be true. I overlaid the taxonomic designations that some researchers had discovered, the breaks and things, and it almost lined up perfectly with the water basin, drainage basins in Australia. And I thought, wow, whoa, that was cool.
That's amazing.
It's almost like it's almost like I made it up. It fit so perfectly with that. And so, well, that makes sense. Why wouldn't that work? And so I was kind of excited about that idea, and that got me out on a bunch of different paths and tangents.
Had that been proposed before as a hypothesis, or have you not seen that in the literature to this point?
No, I hadn't. So that's kind of one of the novel, a lot of these books, I'll admit, we're standing on the shoulders of giants, right? We're kind of regurgitating what's been published in different terms, but we're basically putting other people's information in the book. So this was kind of a novel idea that I struck upon, and then kind of followed that down. And in addition to that, there's a lot of biogeographic barriers that occur in different areas. And so we talked about one in the first edition, the Black Mountain Corridor up near Cairns, north of Cairns in, Queensland. And kind of talked about how the jungle carpet pythons on the north side are different genetically from the ones on the south side. And, that's interesting. And it also, there's all these other species that are different above and below the Black Mountain Corridor. It's a gene barrier for quite a few different species. So, maybe that makes sense that this is a break point in the taxonomy that we're seeing in genetic studies. And so I got to thinking, well, are there others around Australia? So I got to looking, and there's a bunch of others, and they kind of fit in pretty nicely with other breaks in, other carpet python types. So that fit in with the water basin type hypothesis. And so that's kind of one of the things that I was really excited about, and somewhat novel discovery. At least it was novel to me. I hadn't heard that from anybody else. So
yeah, well, that's really cool. Well, and it's such a unique group of species, right? Just because of how different they are appearance-wise, but how genetically close they seem to be, and that's a taxonomy of that group is definitely clustered. So it's really interesting that you could actually discover. I mean, it makes perfect sense. It's kind of surprising that we hadn't thought of that before, right? Like there must be something that's stopping these animals from gene flow across the continent.
Yeah, and I'm sure somebody probably did, but there were some other there's this group of carpet pythons that are kind of more interior. There's the inland carpets, but then there's this group that was attributed to the inland carpet, but that kind of showed some genetic differences from the main group of inland carpet pythons, kind of in the Murray-Darling Basin. And they actually showed some similarities with jungle carpets or carpets kind of in Queensland, northern Queensland. And I'm thinking, how does that work? How are these things out in the middle of Australia aligned with these kind of up more north? And so I looked at the drainage, the river systems that, where there's not like necessarily water in those systems, but there's trees, and, maybe there's a chance, especially in the history of Australia, where there was water or there was a means of travel. And so you could see there was a line pretty much from where these Queensland carpets were down to kind of more of these what we're calling gammons or Flinders ranges. Carpet pythons, and we're actually putting a gammons, I think it's a Flinders range animal on the cover of the book, just because
cool.
Such beautiful snakes. I mean, this thing's just red. It almost looks like if you bred an inland with a Centralian carpet. They're very really bright red, but another desert adapted carpet python, which I just get really excited about. So
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, everybody's definitely excited for that book. I'm sure I'll buy it as soon as it's for sale as well, because it's just nice to have those in the collection. And
Yeah.
you know, and you know, talking about the sizes, it's such a good point. I remember the city I used to live in had a law where you could only have a snake that was 2 meters long. And so I have a jungle carpet, and you know, the first thing that pops up when you search jungle carpet python size is like 8 feet long. I'm not even sure where this website came from, but you know, any government official is going to look that up and go, see, they get 8 feet long, and that's way over 2 meters. And I've never heard of a jungle carpet getting 8 feet long. I mean, maybe, but I'm sure there are some out there, but you know,
they're the exception to the rule.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's like an 8-foot human. You know, they probably there probably has been a couple, but they're not the regular size of a human. So
exactly. Yeah.
And
you've done some herping in Australia, right? You've had some boots on the ground work there. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that and what those experiences or how they changed your herpetoculture in general, just the way you practice keeping.
Yeah. Well, and my first trip was in 2010. So right around the time we were finishing the book, and it was actually my wife who suggested it. She said, we've got 5 kids and they're going to start needing braces and school costs and things like that. She said, you better just go now while you can. And so I planned a trip to go with my dad over to Australia, and we were going to go to the center of Australia into, Alice Springs and kind of look for those desert carpet pythons. That was kind of the dream I had. And so we, as I was getting ready to go, I had met an Australian guy, Jason Boys, at a reptile show in California. And he came through and I heard, he talked to me, Australian addiction, reptiles. Yeah. Okay. And I'm like, there's an Australian accent. Let's talk about Australia, And he said, kind of boiled down to, well, if you ever make it over, look me up and give me shoot me a message or something. So I did that. And he said, that's interesting, because we're doing this symposium at the same time you're coming over. And we just had a person that was supposed to give a carpet python talk bail out on us. And so we need somebody to give a talk on carpet pythons, and you're writing a book on them. So why don't you come talk to us about carpet pythons? I said, for sure. And he said, we'll take you up to Iron Range. So that was that trip to the Iron Range. So we added a few days onto the trip to the front end to go with them up to Iron Range. And I actually got to go up there with some really, some pioneers in, American herpetoculture, and Rico Walder and Alan Rapace, some pretty big names so it was nice to get to meet them and to herp with them and things. And then after that, we had the symposium, and then my dad and I went to Central Australia kind of off on our own to go continue the herping. And I'm trying to, it's interesting, you think, okay, I'm going to Australia, I'm just going to see reptiles everywhere. And, you're expecting just to around every corner.
Like
there's
squirrels.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I got there and I was so excited just to get out. And after that long plane ride, my dad was not feeling great. And so he's like, I'm going to get a hotel and just kind of hang out here. And I said, do you care if I just take off and go, And it was kind of funny because I had a stick shift, and, it's on the wrong side compared to North America. So I was having to shift with my left hand and, buckle my seatbelt from the right or whatever. It was really, and, you'd hit the blinker and it would be the windshield wiper. And so it's kind of funny, but so I took off and just went and hit some spots that some friends had told me to check out. And so I remember I walked around this little lake. What lake was it? It was just a little lake up in, north, or in the area around Cairns. And it was supposed to be a good place for jungle carpets. And so I was thinking, I'll go find a jungle carpet python. There's probably 5 or 6 of them just waiting for me. I walked around the whole lake and, I saw, a few cool things. I saw some birds and some little mammals, and then there was a leaf-tailed gecko that had no tail, so it was just a tailless leaf-tailed gecko, but really cryptic. I was really excited that I spotted this thing. It was blending so well, and it was the cornutus. It's quite a big gecko, one of the, I think it's the longest gecko in Australia, but anyway, that was kind of what I found. And then but that got me excited, and I was all hyped up on adrenaline and drove to another place. And I was driving down the tablelands down towards Cairns on my way home. It was about 3 a.m. by the time I'd, kind of made my way out there, and I'd seen a couple different things, but no jungle carpets or anything like that. But then I'm going down, and there was a snake crossing the road, and it was pretty, narrow, windy road down a mountain, right? And there were trucks and stuff going through. And so I'm like, oh no. Luckily there was a turnaround point. So I hurried and turned around and flipped around and tried to get around. And I had to do like a 3-point turn trying to shift. And it was a little bit of a struggle, but made it around before a truck ran into me or anything. And it was a death adder that was crossing the road. So I, got it off the side of the road with a stick before a truck took it out, and then sat and took pictures of it and just got really excited with this death adder and watched its display, and all that kind of thing. So really, those, and then the next day we got up and went up to Mossman Gorge, and I'd done that the day before looking for Boyd's forest dragons. And so I kind of knew the search image that I had. And so I didn't find any the first day, but then the second day we went back, I was just scanning just about every tree. And then we got up to the top of the trail, and there it was, just exactly how I pictured it. And that image is just burned into my brain, just seeing that Boyd's forest dragon hanging off the side of the tree.
That's
very
awesome.
Cool experience.
They are an amazing species.
Oh yeah. So I guess as far as, seeing them in their natural environment really makes you appreciate, what they're doing out there. And I think, I kind of mentioned this earlier about the temperature. We were driving around Lake Tinaroo up in, the tablelands again, on that same trip a few days later. And it was rainy and kind of cold. It was probably in the low 70s. And like I said, we're not going to find any carpets in this weather. We might as well head back to the camp. And, not 5 minutes later, there was a jungle carpet in the road, and I thought, wait a second, they're not supposed to be, in 70-degree weather and cold, wet conditions. Like, this is, don't you know what you're supposed to do? So that kind of clued me in that, we keep things too hot, or we think of them as needing too much heat. And so that kind of changed my attitude about that a little bit, and how much heat I give them, or how cold I get them in the winter, that kind of thing, give them a little bit of a rest from the hotter temperatures. And I think that's really important. We, dry our things out or keep them too hot, and that can result in a lot of negative effects.
The term cold-blooded, we think that, okay, everything needs heat. If there's no heat, it's going to go downhill fast. And I always look at the weather data, and you have to be kind of careful looking at weather data because it's not exactly the niche that they're going to be in. But if you look at the weather data for Queensland, for example, it does get pretty cold. Like in their winter months, it goes down to, was it like 10, even 10, 12, or in Celsius, but 10, 12, 15 degrees, rainy. And maybe they need that drop in temperatures to thrive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I've kind of incorporated that into my keeping, and just, seeing them in the natural environment. Like I want to be able to see that in my reptile room. I want to be able to see them, doing the things they might do out in nature. And so I've tried to, adapt my caging and things like that to be more naturalistic or larger, or, give them aspects of their natural history that they can benefit from. So that's kind of the main things I changed. But
and it's kind of nice to have an actual mental image of seeing one of the animals in the wild, because then if you do set up an enclosure, you can kind of use that as a base and go, this is exactly what I saw, and that's where they live in the wild. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Now, I guess the other side of that is a lot of times we're finding reptiles under trash and debris on the side of the road.
Yes,
so like
garbage. Yeah.
Yeah. They probably really appreciate like an old moldy carpet that's, hanging out.
A piece of plywood.
Yeah. Exactly. So, that obviously we often when we're taking pictures of reptiles, we're tending to put them in the pristine, natural environment that's right next to this garbage dump or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, we found plenty of things under not so pristine areas. And, carpet pythons are a good example of adaptation to human development in some ways. I mean, some populations are negatively impacted, like by different farming techniques that clear the land and remove trees and things like that. That can negatively impact them. But as far as houses and trees, I mean, I think there's a statistic like 1 out of every 3 or 4 houses in Darwin has a carpet python in the attic.
Oh, wow.
And they're very common and thick in disturbed areas, and in the wild they're very difficult to find in natural habitat. So they've adapted very well. And same with coastal carpet pythons, and on the East Coast they're very common in around human habitation. And so I think to some that's been a benefit for them, and they've actually thrived on some of the introduced species. There were some the Darwin carpets up in that area in the Northern Territory were getting to be very large because they were feeding on the introduced brush-tailed possums. And so it allowed them to get to much larger sizes than previously, they could with the normal flora up there.
Was the brush-tailed possum was another introduced species that Australia tried to tinker with?
In Darwin, yeah. I don't think they were native to that area.
Oh, okay.
They were native to other areas of Australia. But I mean, those have been introduced over to New Zealand and different places like that. So yeah, they do pretty well at adapting to other areas as well. So, but they've taken advantage of that unnatural species in their area to their benefit, I guess.
Well, I remember once I had Ryan McVeigh on the podcast. This was years ago, not his latest appearance, but maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And they did that series with Zilla. I think it was called, Behind the Glass? Yeah.
That was cool.
It's a really cool series. And he said there's this one shot in the opening scene. I forget what species of snake it was. It was some snake. And I think they were somewhere in Southeast Asia, and it's this beautiful shot, and behind it is this like waterfall trickling, and it looks really nice. And he's like, if you actually zoomed out and saw what you're looking at, it's like a snake and then like a drainage ditch into like garbage everywhere. And it's like, that's kind of where a lot of these animals are found, sadly.
Yeah. So I haven't incorporated that into my caging, but I guess aspects of it, because I think, I don't know if you're familiar with what they're calling Retes Stacks, named after Frank Retes, that worked with a lot of monitors. Basically, so I visited him in the late 90s. He was very successful breeding a lot of different monitor species, kind of revolutionized how we think about monitors and, kind of what they need and how to keep them properly. And he would just take plywood that maybe had a strip of wood on one end, and he'd just kind of throw those into the cage. So they'd be jumbled and have different gaps and areas for the monitors to kind of crawl inside there. And then that also gave them kind of a thermocline or a thermogradient. And so they could go to where they needed to be to get to the temperature that they needed to perform whatever they needed to do. And so over the years, those have kind of been, made into different, basically anytime you have wood levels.
I've seen people do
they call it a Retes Stacks. That's although it kind of goes against the original design, but there's still that layer system of different plywood. And so, I do use those in some of my cages, and that's really beneficial. I found that I used it for jungle carpets and had, different levels, and they could go and get to different temperatures and things. And I mean, that's what they do in the wild. They'll passively thermoregulate underneath cover. So they're not, out and they're hidden from predators and things like that. So
that's a great idea, actually, just coming up with more ways to just divide up the enclosure into many different gradients. And that's an easy way to do it. I never really thought about doing that, but it would make sense. It would make sense to use a lot of your space and just creating a stack of hides, essentially, that are all going to be at different temperatures and different humidities and whatnot. That's a cool idea.
Same kind of thing with putting some rails on the ceiling of the cage and putting like a hide box that's ceiling mounted. I really like that too. So I've started doing that with a lot, especially the carpet pythons. They like to be up in tree hollows and things like that. And so they love those kind of roof hide boxes.
They like to do ambush from that position.
Yeah. One of the best things I did was buy a 3D printer. I can print,
you have a 3D printer?
Yeah, so I can just print different things.
There it is right there.
But I'll print those, the rails for the slide box. I can design them to be whatever specs I need them to be. I also I picked this up from a friend, but Antaresia, babies are very, very small. And so I I've been producing quite a few. So I have them in tubs, but I'll print out a little insert that can go kind of along the edges of the tub down, a couple inches, but so it gives them a shelf basically that has a water bowl in it. And so they have, more surface area to climb around. So even though they're in a tub, they have, kind of more area to move around on and things. So
yeah. I feel like 3D really printers are going to be the next thing as far as reptile enrichment goes, because there's so much versatility there, and we've not even really begun tapping into it. I know a few people that are doing really interesting projects with them, and like it just feels like we're at the very beginning of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
That's cool.
So it's fun to design different things, and I've tried to make a few different designs that some of them worked out so well, and others work out pretty well, and I've incorporated that into my keeping as well.
Well, why don't we wrap up talking about your podcast? Because you have a really interesting podcast, and it's very unique. There's a bunch of different reptile podcasts, and more pop up every time. Every time I see Eric on Instagram, he's got another podcast under NPR Network.
Yeah, I don't know how he does it.
It's crazy. It's like constantly growing, so it's really cool to see. And you have a very unique one that's sort of under that umbrella. So why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, I had kind of started a podcast a while back that I would read a scientific paper and, talk about the paper and I thought, it was fun. I really enjoyed doing that. And then I kind of got busy and stopped doing it so much. And then another group came in and kind of did the same idea, and they did it much better. And there were two of them, and that's, what's it called?
Is that Word on the Snake Vine or?
No, I'm embarrassed that I forgot what the name of their. It is Herpetological Highlights.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And they do a great job. The Tom Major and I'm terrible with names, but anyway, they kind of did that and they did it better. So I'm like, okay, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'll let them take the reins there. They're doing great. So I thought, well, I want to do a podcast. I like talking to people and interacting with reptile folks. And so I thought I wanted to do something different than just the traditional interview system. And actually, I think it was I kind of thought about, well, maybe if we could fight about something, because I find myself listening to these podcasts and they're talking about a certain product or something. And the host is just like, oh yeah, cool. But they never like ask hard questions or challenge them on anything they say. I thought, ask them, don't just take them at their word. Like ask them what the benefit is or what, so I find myself yelling at my phone when I'm listening to podcasts sometimes, like ask them this or do this and so I thought, well, that might be a fun podcast to take two sides of a topic and try to support the side that, you get randomly. And so we, have a coin flip and you get assigned, or you get a pick if you win the coin flip, which side you defend. And so, we've had a lot of people say, well, it's not really a fight. We're not actually, really that opposed. And a lot of times we have the same kind of view, but we try to give the other side its due diligence and really try to think about how the other side might be a good thing or have some benefit or whatever. So
is the coin flip authentic? Like, because it seems like every time I listen to an episode, the person who's defending their side, it seems like that's the argument that they studied for. And does it just, or do these people come to the episode with like both sides ready to rock?
Yeah, I mean they should have both sides. I will admit that we have maybe not necessarily rigged, but like if I knew they were an expert in one area, I kind of took the opposite side. If I won the coin toss, I'd kind of take the side that I knew they probably wouldn't want to take. Right. But I don't know. I think if you can't see the other side of an argument, then you're probably not. You're not knowledgeable enough, or you need to research more, because I think a lot of times we have this, like you said, we follow in the footsteps of those that went before us, and we don't really look at other paths. We don't try other things. And so we get stuck in a rut sometimes. And I think, just, it's good to be intellectually curious, think about other things that you haven't thought about. Don't just go along with people who agree with you all the time. Think about why do they think this way, or what makes them tick. And I just find myself doing that anyway. I'm kind of maybe an argumentative person anyway. So I like to kind of play devil's advocate, or like, oh, have you considered this? Or I don't know if I believe what you're saying there, what about this? And so,
right.
That kind of is how it came about. But, and
well,
actually one of your episodes was kind of, I'm like, oh man, he's already doing it. Cause I listened on, and you had,
we did debate on one.
Yeah. And I'm like, oh shoot. Well, and then I listened to the others. I'm like, okay, maybe that's not his normal format. So I can get away with it.
It was a one-off. Yeah.
But yeah, you were definitely an inspiration there. And I thought, oh, it does work. It was a really good to see kind of that debate and see both sides. So yeah.
Well, and that's what I like about it. It's not like it's an anxiety provoking episode where you hear two sides going back to back, yelling and insulting or anything. Yeah. It's a really good, clean conversation. And the funny thing that I find myself doing is I'll see the topic of the episode and I will think in my head, okay, I'm obviously for this one side. Yeah. And then you start hearing the opposite side get presented and you're like, damn, maybe I should be thinking about, like, for example, the power feeding episode was really good because you see an episode about power feeding, you're like, how could anybody support power feeding? It makes no sense. We all know that's bad. And then I forget, it was Nick Mutton was obviously, he was going against the power feeding, but who's the other? Was it Casey?
Casey Cannon, yeah.
Yeah. And so he was great. And he talked about, he laid out an argument of young snakes, neonates and subadults who probably in the wild actually probably have a very high frequency of meals and maybe we should be replicating. So in some ways it's not like, the power feeding to breed, but it exposes this whole other side of the argument that I had never even thought of. And then I'm starting to think like, damn, that really makes a lot of sense. And it's just really good to see that because we are horrible at that in this hobby, especially online, like on Facebook, and just everything is concrete. There's only one way to go and it's not helpful. So it's just so cool to hear those two sides.
Yeah. Well, and I was at a reptile show, vending a reptile show, and I was talking to somebody and we were talking about green tree pythons. And I was kind of talking about some of the things that I learned through my, reading of papers and talking with other experienced keepers, and how a lot of the things that the green tree community was doing were probably not the best for the animals. And somebody was just passing by and he started yelling and saying, what he's telling you is not right. That's not correct. You have to keep him at 92. You have to mist him every day, like basically kind of arguing with what I was saying. I said, well, come here, let's chat for a bit, So I talked with him and after a while he's like, oh, okay, maybe this guy's not an idiot. Maybe he's not just spreading misinformation. So, and I think we get in that mindset that, oh, I heard it from so-and-so and he's an expert. So that's exactly how it is. But anytime you try to make a rule in the animal world, you usually find, that maybe there's other ways as well to think about it, or that they can get away with.
Nothing about biology is black and white for the most part. It's just the way it is. Yeah, so it's a really cool format. And I was also listening to the taxonomy episode actually today when I was driving around. And that was another one too, where I was like, there's no way I would ever be against taxonomy of the system that we have. And then I think it was Casey again. He was outlining, and just makes you think, okay, maybe we do need to restructure some things. And, a lot of these things are, as we've already said, are just, they're convention. And it's really good to challenge convention and find new ways to do things. And I'm jumping around, but going back to the power feeding episode, one of the things that Nick had mentioned, and we kind of already mentioned with the book, is talking about adult size. And people have this goal to reach an adult size. So you feed until you get to that size. And it's sort of there is no adult size in a lot of ways. There's a sort of a rough window, but sure. But trying to strive to get there by feeding is not going to be healthy for the animal in the long run.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, maybe.
Potentially, yes, exactly. Yes, yeah.
Maybe if I always look at that Shine paper where they showed the water pythons that ate, to their heart's content in a good year, they did better over the long course than the ones who didn't eat as frequently. So
exactly, yeah,
it's hard to make a hard fast rule, like a black and white thing. So,
and where do you sit on the taxonomy side? Because you'd mentioned in that podcast talking about the Antaresia. Obviously, you work with them and you wrote the book on it. And there was recently that paper it got rid of Stimson's, right, and combined them with children's, right? With
children's. But then at the same time, it turned spotted pythons into a couple subspecies in a different species. And I don't know, looking at all the different animals that occur in southern New Guinea and northern Queensland, they're basically the same, and they've only been separated for maybe 5,000 years. And so that, they're it's silly to think that that's a different species to some extent, So I guess what really frustrates me is there's no consistency between different groups. It's based on what the person doing the work, their personal belief on what a species is, or what species concept they follow. There's nothing that says if you're doing taxonomy in reptiles, follow this species concept. If you're working with tortoises, or this one, if you're working, that kind of thing. There's no kind of rhyme or reason to it. And so it's just kind of frustrating because you see some groups that are split down to the minutia and others that are just lumped all together, and it just has no consistency. So that's what's frustrating to me.
Well, and it's interesting as somebody who's sort of just takes taxonomy and classification for its word, and I see these things as someone that doesn't really research it in depth. You just trust that there is consistency there, and that there's been some sort of consistent work that separated these things out. But really, it's not. So with that paper, with the children's pythons, was that all based off genetics? Is that how they were making those conclusions? I haven't actually read the paper.
Yeah, in large part. I mean, that's kind of what's frustrating, is because you see that they inhabit different niches, and and they're separated by different biogeographic barriers, and there might be some gene flow, but I disagree with the concept that if different species can interbreed at times. For the most part, they don't, but sometimes that occurs, and you get hybrids in nature all the time. And I think maybe getting into birding has kind of made me more aware of that. There's a lot of overlap with birds where they're so much more mobile, and so I don't know. It's just and again, like you were saying, those guys are the experts, so maybe I'm way off, and maybe I'm just some idiot, yelling about it, and I don't need to be, and maybe what they did was perfectly fine, and I'm sure it is. It's according to the rules and according to what they should be doing, and it's published and it's peer reviewed and all that kind of stuff, and they did it the right way. But sometimes you wonder, are they just in the lab looking at DNA, or are they actually out there looking? And they overlooked one of the biggest questions to me in the Antaresia genus, which is the pygmy banded python, which have completely different scale counts. They're sympatric with the spotted pythons, and they attribute them to a dwarf race of Stimson's pythons, but now they've turned those into children's, and they didn't include them in the analysis, and I know they had samples from those. A friend of mine provided samples and talked about it, said, hey, are you going to look at these things? They're different. And nothing, so they completely ignored those. And so I don't know, are they just looking at museum specimens or DNA, are they out there in the field looking at the animals and seeing them in their natural habitat?
Well, one thing I find very interesting, and I see this more on I would say the advancing side of the community, is when a paper like that gets released, you see it get shared on Facebook as this absolute fact. And that's one of the areas that I think for people that are, trying to advance and whatnot, which is great, I think that's a weakness, is sometimes those keepers, when they see they'll only believe something unless it's peer reviewed. And if it's not peer reviewed, it can't be real. So it's almost like a hypothesis in some ways doesn't exist. Like, it needs to be published for the fact to be solidified. And as soon as it's a peer reviewed, then that's the golden key. That's the golden fact right there. And so I saw that paper make the rounds, and everyone's just like, now this is what I'm calling these. It's just children's, and it was like a complete switch. And there's actually a lot of nuance there, and you can still be pretty critical and scrutinize peer-reviewed papers. It's not necessarily 100% truth. It's just somebody's interpretation of the data.
Yeah, I mean, that's science, right? Exactly. You can always question it. You can always disagree with it. I mean, for crying out loud, at some of these virology meetings, they almost come to fist fights because they disagree so vehemently over this, the same virus, or where they belong, or what they do, or where they hide out, or whatever, And so, you can get pretty passionate about what you believe, and you can, and that's the thing too, is you can often generate data to support both sides. And so that's another part of this, a lot of times it's not as cut and dry as you think. And just because it's science, or just because there's rules, doesn't mean it's easy to lay those down and figure those out. I mean, we've we've had thousands of years to develop some things, and we still don't know a lot about, a lot of things. And the more you learn you don't know a lot,
Yes.
That's the thing, is anybody who thinks they know everything about a subject doesn't know a lot. They're
Exactly.
like, kids have a lot of confidence, but that's not
15-year-olds know everything.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's fine. And I think people should be passionate or excited about learning and thinking about things, but you don't have to just accept it blindly because it's published. So There's always a chance to provide differing data and that support a different hypothesis.
Well, and that's what I love about the podcast you put together, because it allows those conversations to happen in a non-confrontational way. It's two people that are, crafting an argument, and at the end of the day, there's probably no right or wrong answer to any of those topics. It's somewhere in between, and you can actually learn a lot from that. So I think it's a great idea. Are there any? I'm just trying to think of some other topics if people haven't listened to the show. There was the one on UV, there's power feeding, taxonomy. What are a few of the other ones that you can remember off the top of your head?
Let's see. We do delve into some of the topics in herpetoculture. So we talked about like big breeders versus small breed, things like being a commercial breeder, just keeping for the, to enjoy the animals. You don't necessarily have to breed. So different topics like that are more on the herpetoculture side. As far as scientific topic, we do need to get more scientists on. We've reached out to a few things, and that's kind of been an interesting thing too, is because maybe it's the name that scares people off, but it seems like they don't respond as well. So I need to find an inroad to some more experts in the different fields and things. I think that would be very good for the podcast. But I forget what we talk about last week.
It all blends together.
Exactly. It kind of, and I don't like to listen to myself necessarily. So I'm probably bad at reviewing what we talked about.
Once it's up, it's up.
Yeah, it's out there.
Awesome. Well, I'll let everybody go check it out, and then they can hear the episodes, because there's a lot. I think you guys have done quite a few episodes. You know what number you're on?
We're close to our year anniversary, and we've released pretty much one a week. So yeah, we're coming up on, I think we're about 45, 46 episodes. And I'm going to be out of town the next 2 weeks. So we recorded 2 last night, and I've got another one tomorrow. So,
you did 2 in a row.
We've been busy recording, but yeah, that's, we appreciate the people who have kind of brought topics to our attention and told us about some topics. And we like to have, bring people on the show if they are willing and feel like they want to get on there and talk about a subject. So yeah, if anybody out there wants to come on the show, let us know what topic you want to discuss, and we'll get you on. We need to have you on, Dylan.
Yeah, I'll definitely come on. I got to think of a topic, and I'd love to come on. And I'm sure there's some listeners out there that have a topic that they really want to defend, so or argue against for. So yeah, I'm sure you'll find somebody from the listenership that would be interested. Well, Justin, this was a great conversation. I love this. I love what you're doing with the podcast, and it's fascinating, all the writing that you're doing. I cannot wait for the new book to come out. I'm sure I can speak for everybody on that front. Is there anything that we didn't mention today that you wanted to mention before we wrap up? I think we covered most of the things we wanted to chat about.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a great discussion. I really enjoy your podcast, and I'm really honored to be on it. So thank you.
Well, it's been an honor to have you on. Can you let everybody know where they can find you online and any more information about yourself or the book?
Sure. So I have a website, Australian Addiction Reptiles. I don't update it too often, but when I remember to, I try to get on there and put some updated information. But AustralianAddiction.com, and then on social media, I'm just Justin Julander or JG Julander on Instagram. So on Instagram, I just follow pretty pictures of nature. I don't really follow captive stuff. And so I just, if somebody's out doing field work, I'll follow them. But for the most part, it's just that, nice pictures of animals to kind of escape from the normal social media over on Facebook or something.
Yeah, that's smart. You should be more serene than opening up and having all this insane stuff on your phone. Yeah. So that's smart. Okay. Well, Justin, thank you so much. This was an absolute pleasure. Thank you for coming on.
Well, thank you, Dylan.
All right, that is the end of that episode. Justin, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I think I could probably speak for everybody and say we're all very much looking forward to that second edition of the Complete Carpet Python. So hopefully it's out really soon. As soon as it's out, I will be placing an order for it because it sounds like it's going to be full of some pretty amazing content. And thank you so much for giving us a little sneak preview on what to expect in that book. That was pretty amazing. Listeners, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, really the best thing and the most simple thing you can do is just share it on Instagram or Facebook. That really does help bring new listeners to the show. I always really appreciate that. If you're looking for more information on the podcast, head to animalsathomenetwork.com. And if you want to support the podcast financially, you can head to patreon.com/animalsathome. The smallest tier is $3 a month. If you do sign up for that tier, you have automatic access to the Discord server, which means you have access to the other patrons as well. And it's a great community of people chatting about reptiles and sharing pictures of enclosures and their animals and whatnot. And of course, I'm in the server as well, so I pop in and out on usually a daily basis. And I am eternally grateful for anyone that supports through Patreon. I do really appreciate that. Of course, it goes towards helping the show grow. I want the show to get better and bigger and better and bigger and continuously doing that. And the support you guys show me through Patreon, but also just through listening and sharing the content is huge. So I can't thank you guys enough. If you are interested in an Animals at Home t-shirt or sweater, just head to animalsathome.ca/shop. And again, $5 does automatically get donated to the Amazon Rainforest Conservancy. And again, thank you so much to Custom Reptile Habitats for sponsoring this episode. If you are looking for a new reptile enclosure, make sure you head to one of the affiliate links in either the YouTube description or the show notes, or just type in animalsathome.ca/CRH into your URL, into your browser, and it will automatically take you to their website. And then if you do make a purchase, a small commission comes back to me at no extra cost to you. And I think that is it for today's episode. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I will catch you next episode.